if I can put it this way, welcome to the panel on mass atrocities. This is a, but for the crisis in Ukraine, probably the number one subject on the international agenda would be the response or lack of response or adequacy or inadequacy of the international response to events in Syria or in sub-Saharan Africa. We're here to talk about how, in a practical way, if you'll pardon the phrase, the international community can, in practical senses, work effectively on prevention of mass atrocities. And we're doing it in Poland and at the Wroclaw Global Forum at a special time and at the invitation of the government of Poland, which is formally celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Jan Karski, about whom my good friend and colleague Eugeniusz Smolar will talk about a bit more. But without stealing his thunder, just to say that Jan Karski was a Polish patriot and humanitarian in the great Polish tradition. And he not only served in the Polish underground, in the Polish Home Army, but he also took it upon himself at great personal risk, personally to eyewitness mass atrocities against Jews by the Nazis, both in the Warsaw Ghetto and at the Izbica transit camp. And then he later went to the United States, where he was a professor at Georgetown University, where I went to law school, and had a tremendous influence on a huge number of people who came to prominence, including a future president of the United States, Bill Clinton, who was one of his pupils. But the one thing I want to say is it is what Poland has chosen to do as part of the marking of the centennial for this incredible Polish American is also to raise attention and call attention to this idea of the responsibility to protect. And it says a huge amount about Poland, which itself is facing security challenges and whose history is about its own security, that it now wants to honor one of its greatest citizens by talking about contributing to the security of others. So I'm very pleased to be able to help support that effort. And we have here, you have people's taglines. I'm not going to do long introductions, but I would like just to tell you about our panelists. Eugeniusz Smolar is the program director at the Jan Karski Institute Foundation, and he is in charge of the Polish government's efforts to mark the Jan Karski centennial, and it's quite an impressive series of events, intellectual and otherwise, that are planned over the course of the year. Next to him is Walt Slocombe, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon in the United States. I was a very young colleague of Secretary Slocum's during the early years of the Clinton administration, and Secretary Slocombe was really one of the architects of a framework on how to think about when and how to take action in these circumstances, and I think he'll address that as well. Julia Taub is a Canadian journalist who has written extensively and with tremendous insight about circumstances in Syria for a number of prominent publications, and has really been a channel for a Western audience of what's been taking place on the ground in Syria. And also with us, we have the Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Maciej Popowski, who is in charge of security and defense policy for the EU, including preventive diplomacy. With that, I'll ask leading questions to each of our panelists to start, and then we hope to leave half of the session for your questions. But I'd like to launch our discussion by turning to Eugeniusz Smolar to talk a little bit about Karski and the connection to the effort to prevent mass atrocities. Please.
Thank you very much. If you see me going emotional, it's not because I happen to be occasionally an emotional man, but because I have a terrible hay fever. That's point one. Point two, gratitude to Fran, who is with us here, and Atlantic Council, and to you, Lee, that you pick up the challenge to have this debate we've suggested some time ago. We think it's a very topical debate, not only because of Karski, whom we consider who is our patron of our foundation, but also because he's an exceptional man, and I'll try to explain why. Basic facts. Polish Parliament have pronounced 2014 to be Jan Karski year. American Senate have issued a similar proclamation. In 2012, President Obama has awarded Karski posthumously the highest American civilian medal, which is the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This Canadian Parliament only last week have also issued a wonderful proclamation. It is an interesting case, and the question, was Karski unique? Why so many Poles, so many Jews, so many Polish Americans, Jewish Americans, American Americans? When they meet this challenge, this person, they say, wow, we didn't know anything about it. Actually, many historians write to our foundation by saying, when we send them a book or something, they say, we didn't know about the occupation. The realities of occupation in Poland. It is like, I will tell you, because we have this discussion about Ukraine, the Germans have a special feel for the Russians because of the Second World War. And we tell them many more Ukrainians have died in the Second World War than the Russian soldiers, because the Russian ethnic soldiers were saved. And mainly Belarusian and Ukrainians were pushed in Stalingrad. Because the majority of those who died in Stalingrad, ethnically speaking, but were comparatively Ukrainians, etc. The same happens about the occupation, the Second World War occupation in Poland. It is, and so Karski is the key, in a way, to reach a broader awareness of these terrible realities. Well, Karski was a very ambitious young diplomat. And to show you, it is a shock, and I love telling this story. He was a young diplomat employed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a department which, just before the war, was working on ways how to find places for Polish Jews around the world. People don't know about it. He knew about the Jewish problem, quote-unquote problem, because he was raised in Łódź, which was a multi-ethnic community. He had friends which were Germans, Poles, Jewish. He even picked up some words like Bartoszewski, some words in Yiddish, you know. So he was open to it, but he was incredibly loyal and very ambitious young diplomat and an officer. The outbreak of the Second World War ended in tears. He was taken hostage by the Soviets. He managed to escape the fate of Katyn because he was a young officer, but people in his ranks were also sent to Starobielsk and Odessa. He returned to Poland proper, and he joined the underground. And because of his intellectual abilities, his linguistic abilities, his incredible photographic memory, he was immediately tasked for this special purpose. He was to become a special messenger. And those of you who are Polish here, you know the names of Nowak Jeziorański and Lerski and others. He was different. He was not to be a messenger on military matters. He was a political messenger. He was to bring about some solution concerning the structures of the underground state, to agree with the government in exile, and to sort of to help the political arrangement. It's very important that we had an underground parliament in Poland, and we had a kind of a political representation in London. So he was to bring messages between the political parties, socialist to socialist, national democrat, Pilsudskites to Pilsudskites, etc. And he was very discreet, very unpolished. He didn't gossip. So, he made 2 trips successfully. On the 3rd trip, he was arrested by Gestapo. He was tortured, and he attempted a suicide because he was, being a deeply believing Catholic, it must have been a terrible challenge to him. But he decided to commit suicide because he was afraid that he will reveal secrets of the underground. He was rescued by the doctors, and he was rescued by the Polish underground. He was smuggled out of hospital. And after some time, he rejoined the underground, and he was sent on this last mission of his, which became famous world over. His main mission was to inform about the political matters, but he was also asked by his leaders that the Jewish leaders want to see you, the Jewish leader of the Warsaw Ghetto. So he did go to see 2 elderly gentlemen, very emotional, telling what terrible things are happening. Karski knew in general terms what is happening, but he learned the details. And he said, okay, I will pass the message. The message was, they were asking the Allies to do something about it. But I must be credible. It's typical Karski, I must say. In order to be credible, I must see it with my own eyes. I must tell those guys that I actually saw it myself. And he did. He was twice smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto. He saw terrible things. He, as you said, Lee, he was smuggled in a Ukrainian Guards uniform to the Izbica transportation camp, mainly for the West European Jews, who, their possessions, belongings were taken away, and they were put in the cattle train and went to Auschwitz or Treblinka. And these images changed his life forever. In addition to the detailed written reports, he personally delivered this message to the most important people of the Western Alliance. To British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, he didn't see Churchill, and later to President Franklin Roosevelt in the White House. And it was widely described, you can find the description of these meetings. He was shattered. In order to be effective, he had to deliver his message in 18 minutes. And he, in a staccato, he delivered this message, there were some questions, etc., but he didn't get through with on this. Everything was important. The military might of the Polish underground, the resilience of the Polish underground state, what kind of a havoc they can create if there would be a battle between the Nazis and in the last days of war, what could the Home Army do, etc. That was main interest. The Jews were part of the broader picture, and as Eden told Karski, we have to win the war first. He believed to the end of his day that he failed in his mission. He did not fail in his mission, because as different from others, there were other reports about the atrocities in Poland, on Polish soil during the Second World War. But he was the first eyewitness, and he was credible because he was young officer of the Polish army. That was very important. And 2 months after his delivery of his message, the Allies issued the first proclamation to the Germans that the perpetrators will be prosecuted after the war, for example. So, but he personally thought that, after the war he had to stay in the West. He didn't attempt to return to Poland. He would be arrested. And he, as you said, he studied at Georgetown University. He made his PhD. He became a professor, and he taught for 40 years. He was very popular. Steve Mull, who is now an ambassador to Poland, he told me a wonderful story, that he was his student, he came late for his first lecture on communism. And he saw this very tall man, very elegantly dressed in the pre-war style, who with such a passion spoke about communism that, I quote, Mull said, I saw that he's some kind of a bleeding fucking communist, which was wrong. But that was Karski, very passionate occasionally, but very cool and analytical. And you need to read the book he wrote on the Polish diplomacy and the big powers, 1919, from Versailles to Yalta. Very important book and very revealing. All right. Like many others, including the Jews, the survivors, he didn't speak about his experience at all. He just climbed up. It was too much of a shock to the Jewish families, the survivors. It's the same happened in Israel, by the way. There was no discussion until when? First discussion started after Eichmann trial and after the guards of Auschwitz were tried in Germany. This was also a bit of a generation change. The younger generation started to ask questions. Just by chance, Elie Wiesel discovered that the young Karski, and he knew of his reports, is actually teaching 2 blocks from where he had been living, and he approached Karski. And this is for the first time in the late 70s when Karski appeared in the conference of the so-called camp liberators. And Karski was to speak for 20 minutes. He spoke for 55 minutes in total silence. There is a recording of it. There was, people were not, and there was no clapping at the end of his speech. That was apparently a shattering experience. Now, what made Karski unique? Not just his bravery, because there were so many brave people during the Second World War, and not the message he carried, because there were others, comparable messengers, etc. Not even that he delivered this credible eyewitness account of horrors he saw. What makes him different, also in the Polish context, was his humanity, his empathy for the dying, his feeling of responsibility. He said that what has happened is something which shatters our whole view of the humanity. So he felt deep Christian responsibility, as he was a deeply religious man. Regarded as a hero, both in Poland and in Israel, where he received the Yad Vashem recognition and became the citizen of Israel, it was not his heroism in triumph, but his extraordinary integrity and courage. And I would say that it just happened, and I'm ending, that 2 people directly linked with Poland and Polish tradition have influenced the thinking about the genocide and about atrocity prevention. One was Karski, the eyewitness, and the second was Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish lawyer. As a young man, he was already a member of the Polish delegation to the League of Nations, when he tried for the first time to put on the books the problem of genocide. He coined the phrase genocide, but only in 1948. And he, man obsessed, he actually persuaded the delegations, including the US delegation, to put it on the statute book of the United Nations. And in 1949, already during the Cold War, all big powers agreed that we need to have, after what have happened during the Second World War, we need to have some kind of a law against genocide. So on December 9, 1948, Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was formally adopted by the United Nations. And when we thought in our foundations, what could we use as a legacy of Jan Karski, because he's not just a historical figure, we came clearly to the concept of responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention, because that's what it's all about. What happens to the civilians during the times of war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, religious war, etc., etc. And this is the very reason that we wish to dedicate to Karski this very debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And moral, yes. Well, I think that's the perfect scene setter for our discussion, and I think now we'll go as much as possible to talk about practical applications. And so I'd like to start with our senior most serving government official, Deputy Secretary General Popowski, to talk about the EU perspective, noting that the EU really has a special role to play in dealing with these kinds of situations, and has played it. And so we look forward to hearing from you about EU policy and practice.
Thank you, Lee. But I'd like to start with making a link to Karski's legacy. Because as Eugeniusz has rightly said, Karski was a messenger. But at that time, getting the message across came with a huge personal risk. So he was taking huge personal risk. That has changed. The information on atrocities is widely available due to the CNN effect or the other sort of more recent description of the present shock. Everything's happening as we speak. There is a dense network, both in terms of international network of whistleblowers, of international institutions, I mean official, like Human Rights Council of the United Nations, and then the NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. So it's there. But the information is only useful if it's acted upon, and that remains a challenge. That was a challenge in Karski's time, and it remains a challenge today. We may say never again when we talk about Holocaust, Srebrenica, or Rwanda, but yet it does. Yet it does. And so, picking on a few recent examples, there was no lack of evidence of upcoming ethnic or sectarian violence in Central African Republic, Mali, or South Sudan. And yet it happened. So, we simply react very often too late, and this is indeed quite difficult. So that begs the Lenin's question: what to do, or what are we doing as the international community? And I will give you the European perspective. Basically, four lines of action. One is we should be dealing with the root causes of conflict, and this has changed. I mean, most of the conflicts are asymmetrical, internal, sectarian, ethnic, but there are also conflicts caused by access to water, access to land, that's South Sudan, access to water, this is Darfur or Central Asia, minerals, Congo DRC, etc. So we have to be clear on that, and then as a major international donor, which the EU is, I mean the biggest collective international donor, we should redirect our development assistance also to deal with the root causes of the conflict in terms of preventive action. And another addition to that, something that we discussed, or it was discussed in the plenary this morning, this is capacity building in countries prone to conflict or in post-conflict countries. Capacity building in terms of creating accountable institutions, judiciary, rule of law institutions, but also police and armies. You can't do it. You can't really stabilize a situation without creating reliable security institutions. And we are now at the beginning of a new programming cycle of EU assistance, and we are going to deal exactly with that in many countries, in particular in Africa, but also beyond. Then prevention is a very wide notion. It also includes mediation. So we've been doing quite a lot of work on mediation, also training our own people how to engage in mediation, and we are doing mediation at different levels. The best known example is the deal that Cathy Ashton, my boss, struck between Serbia and Kosovo a year ago. That was, in a way, you could say the conflict is over because it ended in 1999, but the problem is not. So there was space for engagement, and we managed to fill this space, and that was a very good example of successful engagement. Another very European kind of preventive action is dealing with the electoral processes. Violence occurs very often in the run-up or after the elections. So if you engage, if you help design the electoral process, if you engage with both parties, and if you observe in a very critical way, it can make a difference. Just think about 2 elections in Kenya in 2008, a lot of violence, 3,000 dead. 2013, rather smooth. Good outcome, well, not perfect, but not bad either. And I happened to be in Kenya in both years. Once as a tourist trapped in a hotel for 2 weeks, and in 2013 as an election observer. And I saw the difference. And then we should make the RTP, I mean the responsibility to protect, principle work. It may not be enshrined in the international law. It's not a binding principle. And yet, we make it happen also by deploying forces, military or civilian, whenever necessary. Over the last 10 years, we've deployed, the European Union, 25 missions and operations, most of them relatively small, with the exception of Kosovo. Some of them are capacity building missions, but some are very specifically designed to create humanitarian space. We did it in Chad with our soldiers in 2008. We are now moving into Central African Republic to secure a certain space there. And this is in the spirit of responsibility to protect. And finally, what is really important is to maintain the integrity of international institutions, in particular the international justice. The international justice is under strain. And so our international institutions, we see this big divide running through the Security Council, a number of issues. I'm sure Julia will talk about it when it comes to Syria. But even on the integrity of international justice, and this is part of the legacy of Karski, and this is part of the legacy of Rafał Lemkin, for sure. We have our deep divisions concerning the jurisdiction of International Court of Justice. And yet, we, the Europeans, we believe this is key. We've always supported international justice, the ICTY Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, the Lebanon Tribunal, the Cambodia Tribunal, and the ICC, and we will continue to do so, because this is a key element of accountability. And let me finish just by one sentence, still going back to Karski's legacy. We see what's happening in Europe. This surge of extremist parties drawing inspiration from Nazi ideology. This is very worrying. The surge of anti-Semitism in Europe, sadly demonstrated by this latest attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels. This is deeply worrying. So we need whistleblowers, we need the bearers of truth, people who would say, speak up, and I hope it will be picked up also by the education system, because it is not over, and it may happen again. So the legacy of Karski also as the one, as a moral authority, remains more valid than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being so specific about the EU's programs and activities in this area, because it's critical that like-minded countries work together. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to be effective. So now let's turn to a U.S. perspective and to Undersecretary Slocombe to talk about the issues and factors that one might need to consider before taking action. Walt.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Just talk. All right. It's a real honor to be here, and it's particularly because it's given me the incentive to learn a little bit about the life of Jan Karski. I want to focus on the problems of implementing the responsibility to protect, particularly as they're seen from the point of view that I saw as an official of the Department of Defense, and in some sense as a citizen of a country that's often asked to provide much of the muscle for such an operation. I think there's no question that mass atrocities in distant countries raise fundamental moral issues, and that as human beings we have, whether the UN says it or not, we have a moral responsibility to act. The problem, of course, is the limiting principle, and one part of the problem is that responsibility is not the only obligation and the only interest. Sometimes there will be conflicts. There are several aspects of it. One is that although eventually we always know, there are often grave uncertainties about what's actually going on, what the scale is, who's really doing it, what the responsibilities are. I think often those are simply invented problems, but they are real. And one of the things which is important is that the international community, indeed national intelligence organizations, and the non-governmental network focus on getting the word out early, because one of my themes is going to be that by the time the question gets to the sit room in the White House, and the issue is the United States going to send military forces to stop a genocide, it's probably too late. And the earlier you can get decisions made, the better off. Second, there are problems of conflicting interests. One problem is that almost always, not always, but almost always, the genocide is happening in some political context. The extreme version being a civil war, a long-term instability within the country of some kind. And I think, unfortunately, in contrast, say, to disaster reliefs, hurricanes and earthquakes don't have a political, the one thing you can say for them is they don't have a political agenda. And almost invariably, an intervention to stop mass atrocities will, as the Marxists would say, objectively mean intervening on or against one side or the other, and that raises all the issues of who are you intervening on, for or against, whatever other interest you have. And finally, and very important from the point of view of the Defense Department, there are real issues of practicality. In his speech at West Point just a few weeks ago, President Obama, talking about situations in which the United States' direct national interests are attacked, said, even we will use military force if it's appropriate, but we have to make sure, among other things, that it's effective. And there is a real issue about effectiveness in the responsibility to protect context. There is, I am afraid, a tendency, it's what I call the whiff of grape shot fallacy. That is, that the arrival of the first company or so of foreign troops will stop this atrocity. Genocides, mass atrocities, are not individual random crimes. They are organized. They are organized by people who think they have good and important reasons to do what they're doing. And they are not simple to stop militarily. It involves, and often they take place in places that are very hard to get to. One of the reasons that it was not an obviously easy thing to do in the case of Rwanda is a long ways away from most places that the United States can deploy military force. I don't excuse our failure to act in Rwanda. I'm only saying that it is, even today, it is not clear to me that we could have done much, but we made a mistake by not trying. But the point is, the estimate for Rwanda, for example, was that to have a reasonable chance of being effective would take basically a division. 20,000 soldiers moved a very long distance from any American facilities. All this is not to say that it can't be done, not to say that it shouldn't be done. I'm very proud of the fact that in Kosovo we reacted reasonably quickly, and although far too many people were killed and too many people were forced from their homes, we were able to produce, by use of military force, a result which was, I think, better than people thought we would have had in prospect. The hardest issue, in some sense, is sorting out of the mass of cases, sorting out which are the ones where intervention is possible. The sooner you can do it, the better. The clearer the facts are, the better. Unfortunately, it is also true that you need to be very careful not to be mesmerized by the CNN effect. There is no particular reason that the mass atrocities that get the most publicity are also the ones that it is most important and indeed easiest to put a stop to.
Thank you very much. And just to say that Walt did not mention this, but while he was serving in the Pentagon was really the lead in developing factors for involvement in multilateral peacekeeping operations. And I was involved in a small way in this project as well. And those factors, I think, have really been enduring and were very much echoed in the report that coined the phrase the responsibility to protect, the kind of prudential considerations about when it makes sense to do what. And that will be my pivot to Ms. Taub. I'll just frame the conversation to say that we haven't gotten into a discussion about what the responsibility to protect is or is not, and we can. But really, the main element is that when a state does not take action to protect people within its own borders against mass atrocities, there is an obligation on the rest of us to do something. Now, exactly what that something is really varies. And it could be military action, but it could also be diplomacy, sanctions, pressure, the range of things that the Deputy Secretary General was talking about as well. So Ms. Taleb will talk a bit about this in the specific context of Syria. Julia.
Yes, thank you, and I'm very glad to be here and talk to you about this very difficult case. As most of you may know, Syria is not an easy case, and that's why there's too much division within the country and internationally. But what I decided to do for this, actually, just to raise a few points that I think interesting or we should know about, and I'll go probably back to what needs to be done and link it back. So it's just for me to determine what needs to be done and how. And for this, I feel I'm going to raise a few points. So I believe the international community did good work in the humanitarian aspect, and they're still sending support and so on. But I also believe that they contributed to the increased violence by sending arms and arming either like the government side or the rebels. So, and here where it comes, I want to just point these facts. During the first 6 months of the conflict, nonviolent resistance in Syria had a great achievement, including mass demonstration of diverse population that generated national and international support. And we had government concessions, I mean, some changes in the law, regardless how they were implemented, and affection among diplomats and officers. And those are very important elements, I believe, to create any change. However, these successes, unfortunately, they were overshadowed by the armed struggle, which invited foreign fighters and extremists into the country and reinforced divisions among religious and ethnic groups. So although the Assad regime is primarily responsible for this atrocity, the armed resistance, however, did contribute significantly to what's considered to be the worst humanitarian crisis in the last 2 decades. So the armed struggle failed really to bring the regime down, to protect civilians, or to bring more rights and freedom to Syrians. The probability of dying in the conflict became 3 times higher once the opposition became armed, and militarization of the resistance has given the regime, as you know, a pretext to use heavy arm and chemical weapon that had not been deployed during the resistance period. Unfortunately, the potential of foreign intervention, military intervention in Syria, has by itself urged many activists to hold arm, thinking that, okay, now we'll have this show, and this is based on one of the interviews I had with a Free Syrian Army member. He said, Julia, we were not expecting really to fight. We thought they're gonna come and save us the way they did in Libya. So, and this, it's very unfortunate because they were not able to think of strategic goals to achieving their goals. And so having supporting international community could have really negative impact in that sense. It's how it's perceived. So taking into consideration this few comments, and I would like to maybe mention other things, many other things related to Syria, maybe in the discussion. I believe the Syrian tragedy showed that the international community is yet to develop an effective mechanism to protect civilian or to prevent atrocity, really. But now what's needed, maybe we need to refocus our effort to create this new emerging maybe norm of responsibility to assist. So in the Syrian case, what I believe, and again, there's divisions about what I'm going to say. I believe we need to work with regional, international actors to stop sending arms to Syria. Doesn't matter who, the Syrian, the rebels, whoever they are. Second, now Syria, as most of you know, it is divided. So we have areas that's controlled by the government, rebel areas, conflict areas. So in the government-controlled area, I believe there's a big chance for the international community to support civil society, civil actions, nonviolent activities or resistance, because those people are exhausted. After 3 years of the conflict, they are exhausted, and they may play a role in pressuring the government to negotiate, to compromise, to do something. So we can pressure, create this type of pressure coming from the government control side. And then now in the rebel control side, what we can do is, especially in certain area in Syria, we have cases of extreme Islamic practices taking place, and we're not used to this in Syria. So in these places, we can counter this effect by promoting more civil institution, like building schools or civil courts, because now we have Sharia law, Sharia courts, so we can support we do have defected lawyers and judges in these areas. We can support them to build civil court and try to counter that influence and create kind of this balance. And going back to Macie's point, is like with the capacity building, especially in these areas, and try to work more in the rebel controlled area. So the point is, in general, we need to support civil movement to create this appealing sample of democracy, mainly in the rebel controlled, to attract people who did not decide yet to join that effort. Let's create this great school with this great educational system where people can express their views. Let's have some sort of model. Let's have some sort of civil courts where people can, it's a sample, so maybe people will change and shift. I'm gonna end here, but I look forward to questions and maybe more comments.
Thank you very much. I think the idea, your thoughts about different responses in different parts of the country, depending on whether they're government-controlled, rebel-controlled, or contested, is very interesting. Okay, so let's open the conversation up to all of you. Open to your questions. Yes, please. And there's is there a microphone? Yeah. And if you would just identify yourself for benefit of all of us.
Ryan Garrity from the New America Foundation. I have two questions related to Syria. The first for the government and former government officials. I'm curious to hear how your thinking has shifted about what can be done in that situation, and also in retrospect what should have been done. I think maybe particularly in terms of the formation of Daesh, of ISIS, and if there's anything that could have been done to prevent that. And then the second question, in Washington, this notion of responsibility to assist has become very commonplace. And I'm concerned that we're sort of leaving behind our responsibility to protect for this much lesser kind of capacity building, which doesn't meaningfully prevent violence.
Okay, and I'd like to take, just so that we can maximize your participation, another question as well. Yes, sir. And I'm keeping a list, so.
Maciej Bartkowski from International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I wanted to follow up on the question about the responsibility to protect, make a comment, and I guess that would maybe stimulate some thoughts on your end. We usually see the implementation of responsibility to protect when the conflict turned into violent one, into civil war. So, for example, in Kosovo, when KLA started fighting violently, that's when the kind of atrocities on the Serbian part started, being more visible against violent armed insurgency. The same thing happened in Libya. Once Libyans took arms, then there was an intervention that followed. And we often see actually those the conflict starting from non-violent resistance and then turning into violence and then international community intervening. The question I would have is that oftentimes actually responsibility to protect encourages people to take arms in the hope that international community can intervene, whereas when they fight non-violently, the international community doesn't have much instruments to help them. That happened in Serbia, in Syria, where there was non-violent resistance going on for 6 months, like Julia said, and a number of Syrians thought that when they take arms, they will encourage then responsibility to protect to kick in and the intervention itself. And there was not much help from international community going for non-violent movements. And that would probably go into this new notion of right to assist for the movements. Maybe you will have a couple of thoughts about this kind of distinction, helping non-violent movements, like solidarity movement, and then vis-a-vis helping violent resistance. How would that work?
All right, and I'm at the risk of overloading, but I want to make sure we give people a chance. Let's take one other.
My name is Richard Kasprzyk. I wonder about the international responsibility in avoiding such conflicts in the first place. Even today, there was a discussion by our Foreign Minister Sikorski about the intention of one of the sides of the conflict, and quite often it's painted in black and white paints. That is, we denigrate the opponents. We make the attribution errors. We think there are quite often arguments that somebody is irrational, that we are the good ones, that the oppositions are scheming, sly tacticians. So I wonder if there is a responsibility of international community to avoid this propaganda of this. I'm thinking of Rwanda, of Mil Collins. There was a radio station that denigrated the opponents, that they were cockroaches. I think it's happening right now. Cannot we stop this violence, nip it in the bud?
Okay, so the questions, just to try to boil it down for the group, are, I guess, looking back on what might have been done at an earlier phase with respect to the Syria crisis. Is the idea of the responsibility to assist a walk back from the responsibility to protect, and I think something about kind of communications and kind of anti-propaganda propaganda. Perhaps we do. Who would like to go first?
Just one thought.
Please.
I mean, it is very interesting that when we moved into the Syria problem, I think we moved away from the central premise of the responsibility to protect, which was about the civilian population. That means the humanitarian catastrophe. It's closer to what you have said about if we are going to help someone, it is against whom are we going to help. That means we are introducing the political calculus into this. And this is a totally different ballgame. It has the same ramification, of course, humanitarian catastrophe. But here we are moving not into the realm of the humanitarian intervention, but rather a catastrophe prevention. We are talking about different things at the same time. And I think that in the context of this debate, we should be very clear that the international community and the United States of America and European Union and whoever that is in no position to help to solve all the conflicts. If people decide locally to kill each other, there is not much you can do about it until it reaches a certain stage, certain mass, when it actually threatens the stability of the region, or it is a truly catastrophe at the Rwandan scale. So let's keep these things slightly separate from each other.
I think that, well, first of all, to state the obvious, it is in international affairs, as in medicine, always better to prevent than to cure. If we had a way to prevent conflicts, we wouldn't have this problem. But saying it would be nice to prevent the conflict, and that we should try, there are things we can do to try. One thing that I think hasn't been mentioned explicitly is that the first responsibility to protect rests on the government and the society in which the events are taking place. And there are sometimes not always, but there are sometimes contexts in which it is possible to put various kinds of pressure on the government, on the state, to act and keep things under control. All too often, these atrocities are not directly conducted by the state itself. They're conducted by forces that are ostensibly outside the control, and that's an important way to put pressure on. I think the Syria example illustrates, you asked why, what else could we have done? I think the Syria example illustrates why it's so hard. First, the actual fact is that the United States is 0 for 3 in trying to intervene and change the arrangements in Arab countries. And trying to sell another one of those is really hard. I'm not saying that's a complete reason, but there is a pattern of avoiding the last mistake. Rwanda was heavily influenced by the fact that the Clinton administration in its second year, having had the problems in Somalia, which was inherited from the Bush administration, was not eager to get involved in another, what would describe as a purely humanitarian intervention. In some sense, Kosovo was illustrated that we'd learned something from Bosnia about how to deal with these conflicts and were more effective. It also illustrates the feasibility problem. I think there are people, for example, who say, oh, if we just had a no-flight zone. No-flight zones are the opiate of the policymaker. You know, in a conflict which doesn't depend upon airplanes, having no-flight zones doesn't make much difference. It is I think it is very much the case that there was a sense, which I believe to be correct, that if we were going to stop the violence, we would necessarily intervene in a civil war, and that was a very large and complicated assignment, not that it's impossible. I am satisfied that if there is a real conflict going on of which mass atrocities are an aspect, or much less heavy civilian casualties, just in general, you've got to face the fact that you have to decide how you're going to stop the war. Maybe you will be able to not totally commit to one side or the other, although I can't think of an example. But you're going to have to, you're either going to have to fight one side or you're going to have to fight both. And that requires, and certainly the American and I think every other military will say, as Shally said, we're not interested in a fair fight, we're interested in winning. And that requires very large forces. It involves casualties, it involves huge costs. One of the things the President made a point of in his more recent speech is that in an essentially humanitarian intervention, it's critical that it be a multinational, multilateral action for a whole variety of reasons. That's an excellent idea. It does make it harder to get agreement. I'm sure I come across as saying we should never do it. It's too hard. I don't mean that. I only mean that if we are to intervene and stop these atrocities, we have to recognize that it is neither easy nor cheap, and that if we can find other means to prevent them, it's vastly better. Not so much because it saves the United States money or even it saves the United States casualties, but because it prevents the atrocities from happening in the first place, or at least getting out of control.
Okay, thank you. And I'm told because of the limited time that we'll treat these as closing remarks as well. Julia, would you like to?
Okay, sure. Quickly, I just want to say something actually about the, also going back to your comment. I truly believe as Syrian, and I know this may not come across, as a Syrian, I believe the true solution for this problem is for the Syrian people to unify, to find a solution themselves. And I know this sounds harsh, but sometimes we have to go through the process as a nation that was suppressed for so long. We have to go through the process. Non-violent, we switched to violent, which I think that was a huge mistake for many reasons. And my point is, we as a Syrian need to find and define that solution, and the international community could just play a role of supporting whatever we suggest. But what we want, we don't know, because it's a process by itself that we have to go through. And I think the role that the international community played, or some actors, in sending troops and increasing and escalating the conflict, that was a turning point that played to the government hands. I think we should have just continued on civil resistance, and there was many ways in supporting civil resistance at that point. I mean, the impact it would have, and I have anecdote, but I'm not sure there's time. Very basic, for example, I'm just going to share this one anecdote with you. In an Alawite town, there were Alawite activists in Banyas, so it has Alawite, Sunni, Christians, whatever. I was speaking to one of the Alawite activists, and she said, Julia, the Alawite community are isolated in a way. They don't even believe that there's a revolution. We just need basic computer to print the brochures, because the communication, the telecommunication is controlled by pro-government. Rami Makhlouf, he's the president, cousin, whatever. So he controlled the communication. So she said, what we need, a printer and a computer to print a brochure and just go to these houses, just to really let them know certain things, distribute basic messages. So this little kind of technological, sometimes support for journalists on the ground to tell their stories. There's tons of ways to support this movement. So I'm just going to stop here.
Thank you. I'll just make 3 points because it's late. First, on the on Syria, what have we done? I think we've done everything we could do short of an intervention in terms of humanitarian support, sanctions regime, and even destruction or disposal of the chemical weapons. But I very much concur with Walt. An intervention, when we talk about intervention, we have to think about feasibility. I mean, what would it, would it have changed much in, those humanitarian corridors or a no-fly zone over Syria? I'm not sure. And the intervention can be quite effective at a given point in time, but the consequences may vary. And we see what's happening in Libya now. The intervention was successful and was the right thing to do. But the situation, in a way, it is even worse than it was, and the spillover effect over the whole Sahel zone is devastating. So we have to be careful about that. Now, on the responsibility to protect, I don't agree that it's an easy encouragement for certain factions to take up arms, because there is no guarantee that an intervention would follow. You can see how difficult it is to arrive at any kind of decision to intervene, with or without a mandate. So I wouldn't make a link. And thirdly, I would not underestimate the importance of capacity building. You can say it's a bureaucratic excuse not to do anything. The problem with capacity building is it's not a quick fix. It takes time and effort and money, and it's not spectacular. Know that we've trained 4,000 soldiers in Mali, and they are now doing the fighting in the north, but it's very difficult to sell in the media. But it's nevertheless crucial, and it's also something that's going to happen, I guess, in Ukraine, both with regard to the armed forces and the civilian security services, because it's badly needed.
So we started a little late, so we're going to end just a little bit late. And I'll just conclude by trying to summarize what we heard from all of you, which is what often happens in these discussions, which is there was a criticism, as Maciej just said, of the responsibility to protect as actually encouraging the taking up of arms by participants in a conflict. And then on the other hand, there is concern that the responsibility to protect is not being adequately implemented with a comment about the responsibility to assist being somehow a walk back. And I would conclude with the point that I think Walt made very, very well, and which is essential, which is that the most important, least sexy, and most overlooked aspect of this idea of the responsibility to protect is the fundamental responsibility of the state itself to protect its own, not only citizens, but people within its own borders against mass atrocities, and just not to do genocide. That is the first and most fundamental aspect of it. And it's only the secondary responsibility, which we all talk about, which kicks in. And so that ought to really be a main focus of what our international actions are, which is to get governments to live up to their responsibilities, and when they can't, to give them the capacity when they need it or to help to provide it. So we've only scratched the surface, but it's been a great conversation. Thank you for terrific questions, and thank you to our panelists. And I think we properly paid tribute to the legacy of Jan Karski in this panel. So thank you.